Some nightmares don't wait for sleep. They strike in broad daylight, right where you feel the safest. A child vanishes from a crowded park. No weaknesses, no trail, just a mother's scream slicing through the summer calm. And then, as if the darkness had never truly left this city, it returns. Quiet, precise, cold, in a world where every clue costs a life. One FBI agent, an unusually perceptive K-9, and a little girl who once survived the unthinkable are the only lights left in a growing storm. You're about to step into an investigation that isn't just a manhunt. It's a descent into something deeper, older, more organized than anyone feared. Forget everything you thought you knew about the serpents. And if you want the truth, every brutal, heartbreaking, jaw-dropping piece of it, hit subscribe on Black Footprints right now. Because from this moment forward, each episode isn't just a story. It's a clue, a countdown, a war. The hunt has begun. Are you ready? The summer sun hung heavy over Seattle's Central Park, its golden rays bouncing off the rippling fountain where families gathered to escape the heat. Laughter drifted through the trees, kids chased bubbles, and the world, for a fleeting moment, felt whole. But then, in the space between heartbeats, it all shattered. Noah, a voice cracked, thin, and panicked. Noah! The scream ripped through the calm like a knife through silk. Sarah Mitchell stumbled across the grass, her shoes slipping on the dewy blades as she pushed past strollers and picnic blankets. "Where's my son?" she sobbed, grabbing the arm of a nearby officer. "He was just here. He was right here." The crowd thickened fast, like blood rushing to a wound. Police sirens pierced the afternoon air as blue lights danced across the skyline. The perimeter was up within minutes. Helicopters circled. 9 units were dispatched. But for all the noise, for all the urgency, Noah Mitchell had vanished. No witnesses, no trail, no Bouvier. Seattle froze. 6 months ago, the city had lived this nightmare already. Emily Carter, 7 years old, taken from her own backyard, found days later in an abandoned house, broken and terrified. Her kidnapper, Richard Hale, had been dragged through every headline, every courtroom camera, every angry finger in the city. His face became the embodiment of evil. His name a curse parents whispered with trembling lips. But now, with Hale rotting behind bars, how could another child disappear under nearly identical circumstances? Inside the Mitchell home, toys still sat in place. Noah's sneakers waited neatly by the front door. A half-eaten sandwich rested on the kitchen counter, as if the boy might burst through the door at any second, laughing and hungry. But the air had gone still. Time had frozen in its place, leaving behind only a hollow, gut-wrenching silence. The media erupted within hours. Another child lost, the headlines blared. Copycat crime or something worse. Talk shows speculated, Twitter boiled, and mothers locked their doors a little tighter. People didn't say it aloud, but the thought lingered like a fog. What if they got the wrong guy? In her quiet home on the other side of town, Emily Carter clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, her eyes darting between the TV screen and the window. She didn't speak much these days. Therapists called it trauma. Her mother called it survival. But Emily watched everything. She listened. She remembered. And she drew. That evening, she slipped another sketch under her bed, a habit no one had noticed. The drawing was crude, shaky lines of crayon across white paper. But the image was unmistakable. A tall man standing in a dark hallway, a strange symbol behind him. It wasn't the first time she'd drawn him. It wouldn't be the last. The symbol, 3 curved lines twisting into a jagged spiral, meant nothing to her therapists, nothing to her mother. But to Emily, it meant something. It warned her. She didn't have words for what she saw that night in captivity, only this shape, this presence. And now another child was gone. Somewhere in the city, a storm was gathering. A predator had returned, or perhaps had never left. And as the sun dipped behind the skyline and the shadows stretched across the sidewalks, one thing became horrifyingly clear. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jack Monroe had been with the FBI for 15 years. He'd seen the worst of humanity, cartel butchers, serial predators, men who smiled with blood on their hands. But this was different. Sitting alone in his office, the walls lined with old case files and fading photos, Monroe stared at the Carter file. Again, 6 months had passed since they closed it, since Hale had been cuffed and the media declared the monster caged. But something about it still scraped at the inside of his skull like a rusty nail. Too clean, too neat, too convenient. He leaned back, exhaling slow, staring at the photo of Emily Carter tucked in the folder. Her wide eyes, her hollow stare, it haunted him more than most. He flipped to the back of the report. There was again the single line that never sat right. Rex led us to the girl. That damn dog. German shepherd, dark coat, sharper than most agents. Monroe had never been a dog guy, but even he had to admit, Rex was different. Almost unsettling. Like he could smell the truth in a room before anyone else could feel it. That afternoon, Monroe stopped by the K-9 training facility. The place buzzed with drills and barking, but Rex was still. Ears high, eyes locked on Monroe like he'd been waiting. Hey, partner, Monroe murmured, crouching to meet those amber eyes. You remember, don't you? Rex didn't move. But when Monroe stood, the dog stood too. They drove east, toward the rundown industrial strip outside Seattle. Monroe wasn't chasing a tip, just a hunch. One of those bone-deep instincts he'd learned not to ignore. As they passed an old warehouse cloaked in rust and weeds, Rex growled. Low, deep, primitive. Monroe slammed the brakes. The dog launched from the back seat, nose pressed to the chain-link fence, muscles rigid. Monroe followed with a flashlight and a gun drawn, the silence around them broken only by the distant hum of traffic. He pushed through a gap in the fence. The warehouse door creaked open like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something fouler, gasoline. Then he saw it, tiny footprints in the grime, too small for an adult. A child had been here, recently, and suddenly he was back in that damn courtroom, listening to everyone pat themselves on the back for locking up Hale. But Hale was in prison. So who the hell was still out here, taking children? A sound snapped him back, a rustle outside. Monroe turned, gun ready. A man stood in the shadows, arms raised. Homeless, by the look of him. Late 50s, eyes glassy from the cold. Easy, Monroe said. You live nearby? The man nodded. Just down there, he mumbled. Didn't mean to startle. I'm Agent Monroe with the FBI. I'm looking into a missing child. The man hesitated. You won't believe me if I tell you. Try me. A long pause. Then, quietly, there were 2 vans the night the little girl disappeared. Everyone talks about the white one, but there was another. Black. No markings. Monroe's pulse spiked. Did you see the driver? Just for a second. Big guy. Tattoo on his arm. A snake wrapped around a number. 89, I think. Monroe's heart dropped like a stone. The Serpents. He hadn't heard that name in a decade. A syndicate so ruthless the FBI had torn through half the West Coast to crush them. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. And now, maybe, children. He looked at Rex, who hadn't stopped growling since they arrived. The dog wasn't just remembering something. He was sensing it. Something dark. Something unfinished. This warehouse wasn't just a scene. It was a signal. And if Monroe's instincts were right, Rex hadn't just found a clue. He'd opened a door the whole city had been too afraid to look behind. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above Lisa Grant's head as her fingers danced over the keyboard. The FBI's cybercrimes division was quiet that night, too quiet. Outside, Seattle lay beneath a curtain of rain, but inside this concrete bunker of firewalls and encrypted data, the real storm was brewing. She narrowed her eyes at the bank logs on her screen. Monthly wire transfers. 3 years. Cayman Islands. The recipient, Richard Hale. The same man the world had branded a lone monster. The same man currently rotting in federal prison for kidnapping Emily Carter. Jack, Lisa called out, her voice tense. You need to see this. Agent Monroe stepped into the room, drenched from the field, coat still dripping. The weariness on his face deepened as he leaned over her shoulder. These transfers aren't random, Lisa said, pointing to the screen. They're structured, consistent. They come from a shell company, Black Ridge Holdings. Monroe blinked. Never heard of it. You wouldn't, she muttered. It's one of 20 flagged offshore fronts tied to a defunct syndicate. You remember the serpents? His jaw tightened. Yeah, we dismantled them a decade ago. Looks like someone forgot to tell them they were dead. Monroe stared at the screen. The numbers weren't just payments. They were payroll. Richard Hale hadn't acted alone. He was getting paid. Regularly. Silently. Son of a bitch, Monroe growled. He was a pawn. Lisa nodded grimly. And whoever was moving the pieces is still in the game. She clicked through another series of windows, then froze. Her hand hovered over the mouse. What? Monroe asked. Surveillance footage, she whispered. 2 days before Emily was taken. Gas station. 1 mile from her house. She enlarged the video. The image was grainy, distorted by poor lighting, but the figure was unmistakable. A tall man in dark tactical gear, standing by the pumps. Broad shoulders, military posture, and a scar, jagged, stretching from temple to jaw. Monroe's blood turned to ice. Joseph Kleen. He hadn't heard that name in years. A former special ops soldier, dishonorably discharged under classified circumstances. Since then, Kleen had become a ghost, working private security for the kinds of people who paid in diamonds and silence. Cartels, warlords, traffickers. The kind of men who made the serpents look like amateurs. He's supposed to be off the grid, Monroe muttered. Well, he's not, Lisa said. He's back. And he was right there, circling Emily's neighborhood like a vulture. Monroe sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing. Hale had the record. Kleen had the skills. But neither of them moved like a mastermind. They were soldiers, executors. That meant someone else was calling the shots. A flicker of memory hit him. The drawings Emily had stashed under her bed. The figures standing in the shadows. The mask. What if, he murmured, more to himself than to Lisa, there's someone else. Someone even Kleen answers to. Lisa looked at him. You think there's a third man? No, Monroe said, standing slowly. I think there's a leader. Someone who stayed hidden while Hale took the fall. Someone who watched from the dark with a mask. The weight of that possibility settled into the room like a storm front. It wasn't just one predator. It was a network. Alive, evolving, and ready to strike again. As Monroe stared out into the night, the reflection of the surveillance video flickering in the glass, he felt it deep in his gut. The serpents weren't dead. They'd been waiting. The Carter house sat quiet under a gray Seattle sky, the kind of stillness that settled like fog in the lungs. Agent Jack Monroe stood at the porch, staring at the peeling paint on the front door, wondering, not for the first time, what it meant to be the only child to survive a monster. He knocked. Sarah Carter answered, worry etched deep into her face. She's not been sleeping again, she whispered. Every time she closes her eyes, she sees him. Monroe nodded, his voice low. I won't push her. I just need a moment. Inside, the living room was filled with soft shadows and the scent of lemon cleaner. Emily sat on the floor, knees tucked under her, a coloring book open in her lap. She didn't look up. Her small hand moved in slow, deliberate strokes, filling the page with dark charcoal lines. Rex sat beside her, silent, still, but Monroe noticed the subtle way his ears twitched, his gaze locked onto Emily as if awaiting a command. Hey, Emily, Monroe said gently, crouching beside her. Remember me? She gave the faintest nod, but didn't speak. I wanted to ask you something. About that night, when the bad man took you. Do you remember if he was alone? Her hand stopped moving. She blinked slowly. Then, in a voice like wind through dry leaves, there was someone else. Monroe leaned in. Was it this man? He asked, holding out a printed surveillance still of Joseph Kleen. Emily glanced at it, shook her head. No, the man who watched didn't have a scar. He wore a mask. A mask? Monroe asked. She picked up a red crayon and began to draw again. A tall figure, featureless. Dark eyes, a jagged outline where a mouth should be. I couldn't see his face, she whispered. But he never looked away. Monroe's pulse quickened. This was it. The missing piece. Not Hale. Not Kleen. Someone else. Someone pulling the strings. Then Emily did something strange. She raised her hand slowly, formed a small sign with her fingers, 2 taps to the chest, a fist clenched, and a point toward the ground. Rex stood up. The dog's muscles tensed, his ears perked, and he let out a low whine, walking toward the window as if searching for something unseen. Monroe's eyes widened. What? What was that, Emily? She looked at him, finally meeting his gaze. That's how I told him where I was. Told who? Rex, she said simply. Monroe sat back, stunned. During her captivity, Emily, terrified, alone, had created a silent language. A signal, and somehow Rex had understood it. Maybe not in words, but in instinct, in connection, and it had led him to her. Did you ever use that signal after you got out? Monroe asked. She shook her head. No, I only do it when I feel him again. The man with the mask. Monroe stared at her, and then he remembered something. Just days ago, Rex had frozen in front of the abandoned warehouse. Not just barked, not just growled. He had looked at Monroe, then made a subtle movement, 2 taps with his paw, fist clenched in his stance. A glance at the ground. The same signal. Emily had been feeling him again. And Rex? Rex knew. This wasn't over. The masked man wasn't just a memory. He was still out there, still watching, still hunting. Emily Carter was no ordinary witness. She was the thread. And whoever had taken Noah Mitchell, whoever wore that mask, they were already closer than anyone feared. The motel sat like a forgotten scar on the edge of town. Peeling paint, neon sign flickering with the last of its dying light. Monroe pulled the SUV into the gravel lot just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long, bleeding shadows across the parking lot. Room 207. That's where the trail had led. Joseph Clean had been there. But now, the room was silent. The team moved in fast, guns drawn, breaths held, but all they found was absence. And one chilling reminder. A single wooden chair, overturned. A length of rope still tied to one armrest. The faint, metallic scent of sweat and blood lingered in the air. On the mirror, scrawled in thick red marker, were 4 words. You're too late. Monroe stared at them, his jaw locked tight. He knew, he muttered. He knew we were coming. Lisa Grant typed furiously on her tablet, rerouting surveillance footage, scanning traffic cams, but everything pointed to one thing. Clean was always one step ahead. Monroe stepped outside, dragging in the cool night air, trying to still the storm churning in his chest. He didn't like being outplayed. And Clean wasn't just slipping through the cracks. He was dancing through them. Then his phone buzzed. No caller ID, just a block of static on the screen. Monroe answered, his voice low. This is Agent Monroe. For a moment, only silence. Then a voice, distorted, metallic, cold. You're asking the wrong questions. Monroe's fingers tightened around the phone. Who is this? The voice chuckled, slow and deliberate. You think it's about Clean? But he's just another pawn. What do you want? A pause. Then, almost like a whisper, ask the girl. The line went dead. Monroe stood frozen, the hum of the disconnected line echoing in his ears. Emily. Again. Every thread led back to her. Inside the mobile command unit, Lisa looked up, her face pale. Jack, you need to see this. She held out one of Emily's newest drawings, scanned and enhanced for clarity. Amid the scribbles and shadows, one detail stood out. A symbol. 3 intersecting arrows forming a circular spiral, tucked in the corner of the page like an artist's signature. Monroe narrowed his eyes. That wasn't in her earlier sketches. No, Lisa agreed. But it's real. She tapped her screen, pulling up a satellite map. This matches a decommissioned train station. Underground. Abandoned since 1998. No servales, no utilities. Officially condemned. Where is it? Lisa zoomed in. Beneath the East Lake Industrial Zone. 3 miles from where we found Noah's footprint. Monroe felt a chill crawl up his spine. What if this isn't just a memory? He said quietly. What if she's trying to lead us somewhere? Not trying, Lisa corrected. She is. For a moment, the only sound was the soft rumble of passing traffic above their heads. Then Monroe turned to his team. Gear up. We're going underground. As they prepared to move out, Rex let out a low, guttural growl, his body rigid, eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't just instinct. He felt something. Emily Carter had survived what others hadn't. And now, with every sketch, every silent signal, she was guiding them toward the darkness, toward the beating heart of something much bigger, much colder, and far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The hunt wasn't just for Clean anymore. It was for whatever he'd been protecting. And the girl knew exactly where it was hiding. The steel door creaked open with the sound of something ancient breaking loose from time itself. The flashlight in Monroe's hand cut a narrow path through the suffocating darkness of the old Eastlake station. Concrete walls peeled with mold, pipes wept rust, and the air was damp, heavy with a scent that didn't belong anywhere near the living. This wasn't just some abandoned platform. This had been used recently. Lisa Grant stepped in behind him, eyes locked on her scanner, Rex trotting beside her, nose low to the ground. The rest of the team fanned out, weapons raised, boots echoing off the tile like ghost footsteps. In the far corner of the platform, behind a wall of crumbling lockers and overturned benches, they found it, a reinforced steel cabinet embedded into the concrete. Monroe pried it open with a crowbar. Inside were boxes, dozens of them, unlabeled, neatly stacked. Reed, the unit's profiler, pulled the top one down, flipped it open, and went still. "Jack," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." Inside were files. Paper, not digital. Old school, deliberate. Each file held a photo, a name, a birth date. All children. Some were familiar. Some had made national headlines. Others had simply vanished into silence. Lisa's hand shook as she pulled out the next box. 15 names, she murmured. Each one has a photo and a status note. She held up a sheet. 8 of the names were crossed out. "Dead?" Monroe asked. Lisa nodded. "Most likely." Reed's voice was grave. "These aren't just missing children. They were being tracked, processed, like inventory." Monroe's stomach twisted. This wasn't a series of isolated kidnappings. This was a system. Then Rex barked, short and sharp. He had found something else. Behind a loose wall panel, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a small black hard drive. Lisa plugged it into her laptop on site, fingers flying over the keyboard as the rest of the team stood in tense silence. The files were encrypted, deep, military grade. But one folder had been left open. Audio logs. Monroe clicked on the first file. A low hiss, then a voice, muffled but unmistakably human. "Hail, the Carter girl is secured." Pause. A second voice, deeper, colder. "Good. Transport her to the next location. She is not to be kept." Monroe's breath caught. Next file. Same cold voice. "The FBI is closing in. Burn everything. Eliminate them. No traces. No names." The room went silent. Even Rex stopped moving. Lisa covered her mouth. They weren't just running a trafficking ring. They were tying up loose ends. "This whole thing was organized," Monroe muttered. "Structured. Like a goddamn military op. And someone had known they were coming." Lisa's laptop buzzed suddenly. A new message. No number. No trace. Just 2 words glowing on the screen. "We are not done." She looked up, her face pale. "They're watching us." Monroe stood slowly, heart pounding. The files, the recordings, the message. This wasn't a victory. It was a warning. 15 children, 8 possibly dead, 7 unaccounted for. And the worst part? Emily's name was on that list. But it wasn't crossed out. Not yet. The call came in just after dawn. Monroe was sipping stale coffee in the operations room, staring at the corkboard littered with photos, maps, and red string that felt increasingly futile. The team was exhausted, the air thick with frustration and the weight of too many unanswered questions. Then Lisa burst in, her voice breathless. "Jack, it's her. One of the kids from the list." Monroe shot to his feet. "Alive." Lisa nodded, eyes wide. "Emma Sullivan, age 9. She was found wandering outside a forest reserve in Pierce County. Dirty, thin, confused, but breathing. A miracle, or something close." By the time Monroe reached the hospital, Emma had already been stabilized. She sat curled up on the edge of a hospital bed, a gray hoodie 2 sizes too big swallowing her small frame. Her eyes darted around the room like a deer that hadn't quite decided whether it was safe. He entered slowly, cautious not to scare her. Emma, he said gently, crouching to her eye level. My name is Jack. I work with the FBI. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you. She didn't speak, just stared. Then she reached to the tray beside her, picked up a red crayon, and began to draw. Lisa, standing just behind Monroe, leaned in as Emma worked. The lines were shaky at first, hesitant, but then they started to take shape. A staircase leading underground. 3 arrows in a circle. A figure in a mask. Monroe's voice was barely above a whisper. It's the same symbol Emily drew. Lisa nodded. Almost identical. Monroe turned back to Emma. Do you remember Emily? Emily Carter. Something flickered in her eyes. Then she nodded. Slow. Certain. They were together, Lisa murmured. At some point, they were in the same place. Emma's doctor stepped in quietly. She's suffering from memory disruption, probably trauma-induced dissociation. But her physical exam shows signs of long-term confinement. Malnutrition, old bruises. She's been gone for months and somehow survived. Monroe felt a cold fury rising in his chest. Emma Sullivan had been listed as deceased 6 weeks ago. A misidentified body found near a riverbank had matched her age and clothing. The file had been closed. Another family giving grief without closure. And now here she was. A ghost returned. He knelt beside her again. Emma, do you know where the badman took you? Can you show us more? She shook her head, then drew again. A room, metal walls, a drain in the center, no windows, but in the corner, a bed. And on that bed, a girl with a rabbit doll clutched tight to her chest. Emily. It was her. Lisa's voice broke the silence. She remembers. She's trying to give us a map, piece by piece. Monroe exhaled slowly, watching Emma's fingers work the crayon across the page like it was the only language she had left. This wasn't just about finding who had taken them anymore. It was about what they saw while they were there, what they remembered, or maybe what they weren't supposed to. 2 girls, 2 survivors, 2 keys to a lock no one knew existed. And whoever had let Emma go hadn't done it out of mercy. They had done it with a message. We control the story. But now, with Emma back, the narrative had changed. And maybe, for the first time, Monroe had something the monsters didn't expect. Hope. The storm broke just past midnight. Rain slamming against the windows of FBI headquarters like fists, lightning clawing across the Seattle skyline. In the war room, fluorescent lights flickered over maps, crime scene photos, and a digital countdown ticking in real time. Lisa Grant leaned over her laptop, face pale, fingers trembling as they flew across the keyboard. I've traced the latest data packet, she said, breathless. Encrypted relay out of Belarus. Bounced through 3 proxies, but the destination server was tied to a secure network used by the Serpents a decade ago. Monroe stepped closer. What were they sending? Lisa turned her monitor. A list appeared, coordinates, timestamps, and a name. Camp Oak Ridge, a summer camp nestled in the woods, 40 miles outside the city. Dozens of cabins, over 100 children, isolated, no surveillance. The perfect hunting ground. Monroe's jaw clenched. When? Lisa hesitated, then clicked into the most recent message. Phase begins, 2400 hours. That's midnight tonight. She pulled up another image, Emily's most recent sketch. Done just hours earlier. A crude drawing of a watch face, hands frozen at 12. Beneath it, scrawled in her shaky handwriting, 024. A countdown. A warning. Monroe didn't wait. Gear up. We're moving now. But even as his team sprang into motion, Rex barked sharply, once, twice, then bolted toward the hallway, tail stiff, eyes wide. Monroe caught up with him by the door, kneeling. You smell it, don't you? He whispered. It's happening. Rex growled low, deep in his chest, and Monroe knew the dog's instincts hadn't failed them yet. The convoy sped through winding country roads, rain hammering the windshields, trees bending under wind like they were trying to speak. The forest closed in as Camp Oak Ridge appeared in the clearing. Eerily quiet, lights off, cabins dark. Something wasn't right. Where are the counselors? Lisa asked, stepping out of the SUV. Where are the kids? Reed added. They moved fast, sweeping cabin after cabin. Empty beds, backpacks abandoned, a dropped teddy bear still damp from child's hand. The place hadn't just been evacuated. It had been cleared. Suddenly, a shout from the tree line. One of the agents. We found tire tracks. Multiple vehicles. Headed west. Monroe's heart dropped. They were already too late. Rex barked again, running toward the edge of the woods, nose to the ground, tail lashing side to side. Monroe followed, and that's when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. He stared at it for a second before answering. The voice was slow. Cold. Familiar. You're trying so hard to stop it. Who is this? Monroe snapped. A low chuckle. You think you're chasing a man. You're not. You're chasing a machine. An order. A design. Monroe's eyes scanned the darkness, feeling the chill creep into his spine. Where are the children? A pause. What's lost can be remade. Then the click. Deadline. Lisa ran up behind him, breathless. They had help on the inside. Camp staff. All part of it. Monroe didn't speak. He was already looking down at his phone. A new message appeared. No number. No trace. Just 5 words. The game begins tomorrow. He looked up at the sky. The rain had stopped, but the real storm was just beginning.